cleanup is Gopal Dayanini, who is in our book, Building the Green Economy. He works for social, economic, environmental, and racial justice through organizing and campaigning, teaching, writing, speaking, and direct action. He serves on the Planning Committee for Movement Generation Justice, an ecology project, and the Rocket Society and the International Accountability Project. He's the lead organizer of the Education Circle of Change. He's an elementary and early childhood educator, and a lucky dog. He currently stays home with his children and crams in political projects on the side.
I think I'm going to start by taking a big step back, because I actually don't think this is a technical question or even a like what works, what doesn't work question. I think it's actually a value proposition. And I think for you to have any reason to care what I say, you should have a little sense of like kind of the value base that I'm coming from. So I'm going to burn up a little bit of time to take a big step back. So this is about the relationship between ecosystems and economy. And eco means home, and your ecosystem is the system of your home. It's the basin of your relations, as Brock Goldman calls it. It is all of the relationships between the people, the living things, and the non-living materials in a place. An ecosystem can be as small as a ripple in a pond, and it can be as big as the planet. The economy, economy, is the management of your home. It is how you govern those relationships. And we get to decide what kind of economy we want, what kind of management of home we want. You walk into Trader Joe's and you grab a can of organic black beans and you flip it over and it says, product of China in it. China is part of your food shed. Your food shed is not a 100-mile radius from where your farmer's market is. Your food shed is not defined by the geography of a watershed. It's defined by where you get your food, right? You globalize the economy, you globalize the ecosystem. And when you globalize the ecosystem, you are now in relation with everybody else. And now you have to ask the question, what kind of relationship do you want to have with those folks? Can you actually have real relationships with those folks, right? I would also like to point out that when you globalize the management of your home, when you globalize the ecosystem, then its failures become systemic and catastrophic. The mistakes of that economy become systemic and catastrophic, right? Like if a community, a local community of folks outstrips their resource base, they get wiped out, kind of like beavers. Beavers do their thing, it messes everything up, there's big transformation, they move on to another spot, the place restores itself, maybe they come back, maybe they don't, right? So the planet can handle a community wiping out its resource base and either making itself extinct or having to move on. What it can't accommodate is us excising, a lung of the planet like the Athabascan boreal forest, right? And I would also make the proposition that the systemic problem is not climate change. The systemic problem is the catastrophic collapse of the biosphere and the ethnosphere, biological and cultural diversity. And biological diversity, we understand how that's collapsing, I think fairly. I think a lot of folks here probably do. But the ethnosphere is collapsing under two kind of key pressures. One is the obliteration of traditional evolved knowledge through the extermination, displacement, and extinction of indigenous peoples, land-based peoples, traditional peoples. We're wiping out the traditional evolved knowledge we need to survive. The second way the ethnosphere is collapsing is through the exportation of a monoculture through kind of three main mechanisms. Thank you. One is development, the development paradigm and growth. The other, I would argue, is schooling, and the other is, but that's a whole other conversation. And the third is the consumer culture. Okay, full stop. Let's move on. And actually, I think the solution to that is a form of, even though my wife told me not to say this, a form of reparations, which I would argue is repairing our relations. And there's a past component to that, a present component to that, and a future component to that. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about what my issue with offsets is. I have three kind of main issues with offsets. One, they're structural, that fall into three categories: structural, technical, and cultural. And they kind of line up a little bit with the past, present, future thing, which is why I said the first part. Sorry, I'm talking fast because I want to stick to my time. So, structural. One of the basic assumptions of an offset, and actually all of the market mechanisms, all of the financing around climate, is that you can actually price carbon. that you can actually put a price on carbon. That's one of the underlying assumptions of the particular kind of economy we have now, the market economy, which robs from the web of life and puts into the chain of the market things which probably should remain intact into a web of life in a basin of relations with us, like forests, people, labor, right? Labor, forests, atmosphere, oceans, fresh water, put into a chain of a market. Carbon fundamentalism, the idea that you can price carbon, that you can reduce the problem to carbon, is strategically useful framing because it eradicates everything about the life cycle of that carbon. The source, how it was produced, the implications of it. It can't contain the full cost. And if you attempted to, I would argue that there's a value proposition there that's very hard. Like, for example, how do you offset oil from Nigeria? 4 decades of military dictatorship. I'm not entirely sure I'm willing to put a price on Ken Saro-Wiwa's life. So there's a pricing. The pricing of carbon is one piece of the problem for me, and it goes with the pricing of forests and the pricing of other things as well. And I wanted to give you an example on skipping. I'll come back if you ask. My next, and I think the thing, and how that relates to the past is that carbon fundamentalism makes it a here and now technical problem about the atmosphere and not about the entire history of the system and the relationships that got us to this place. My second concern about offsets is technical, and this is where the CDMs and other things come in. There are actually very specific problems with the way offsets function, and very specific problems with very, very many of the kinds of offsets that get funded. One of the first problems is, and it was already brought up, is additionality. This idea that you can determine what would have happened in the absence of the financing for the clean development project, quote unquote. That's called additionality. That requires a certain kind of crystal ball. It's actually based on a very well-established financial mechanism or financial assumption thinking called speculation. And if there's one thing I've discovered over the last several years, being married, watching the housing crisis, and being engaged in ecological issues, is speculation is bad for relationships, it's bad for the environment, and it's bad for the economy. Technically, what you are offsetting is not the emissions that come from the Chevron refinery in Richmond. You are also attempting to offset with whatever it is that gets paid by whatever corporation, including Chevron, trying to do a project someplace else. You are offsetting high rates of birth defect. You are attempting to price and offset asthma. You are attempting to price and offset the exploitation of the communities who live near these dirty, polluting refineries and power plants. One of the failures of the ways that we have framed offsets, particularly those of us on the left, has been to think of it as a north-south issue about our consumptive way of life being offset by clean development in the global south. Our consumptive way of life has consequences for us here in our communities at home. It's dirty power plants and refineries. It's coal mining in Appalachia. It's the mountaintop removal. It's nuclear waste dumping. It's all of it, right? And I would point out that the Chevron refinery is attempting to expand so it can take dirtier crude from tar sands in the Athabascan boreal forest in Alberta, Canada, displacing indigenous peoples, right? And I guarantee you they are looking at any of a number of ways they can attempt to offset that through buying of forests in other parts of the world, potentially planting, genetically engineered eucalyptus plantations where intact, biodiverse forests where human and where evolved knowledge has been integrated. I don't see my timekeeper. I've got to be really close. Yeah. Okay. And on and on. So I'm going to leave that. And I'm going to move on to my last thing. My last concern about it is cultural, and that's really about the future. What kind of world do we really want to live in? I think offsets predate on 3 basic cultural forms: guilt, growth, and greed. The guilt is the idea that because you got on a plane and flew somewhere, you should feel bad about it and then throw money into a machine at the airport that's going to somehow miraculously finance something that you presume is clean someplace else.